Hello, I'm Claire Smith and welcome to my channel. So today I'm going to talk about the history behind three really famous fragrances, and these three fragrances all have a really interesting backstory to them. So if you haven't seen me before, I'm Claire Smith. I make videos all about perfume, perfume science, perfume history, perfume psychology even, and I also just do some straight perfume reviews. So if you haven't already subscribed, then please do consider subscribing, and also please like this video if you do end up liking this kind of content. So I made a similar video to this about a year ago called What's in a Name, where I talked about the history behind the names of fragrances such as Baccarat, Rouge 540, Givenchy, L'Interdit, and also some Tom Ford fragrances. So if you haven't seen that video, I will leave it linked down below in case you do want to check it out. But today I'm going to talk about three completely different fragrances, and the first one of these is going to be the history behind Narciso Rodriguez for her. So 2023 really heralded the 20th anniversary of the Narciso Rodriguez for her line. The original EDT in the black bottle was released back in 2003, and it's really set the tone for the DNA of the Narciso Rodriguez house. You don't think of Narciso Rodriguez fragrances without thinking of the very signature Narciso Musc that is in nearly all of their fragrances. So why has the Narciso Rodriguez for her line been so successful? Why, even after 20 years, is a bottle of that line said to sell in the world every 15 seconds? Well, I think the more recent success of the Musc Noir Rose flanker, which was released in 2022 and really became a TikTok sensation, has really helped with those sales figures. But why was the original Narciso Rodriguez for her EDT so successful, and what inspired that fragrance? So Narciso Rodriguez for her is all about musk. It's a floral, woody musk, and it's really a sensual musk surrounded by osmanthus and amber to give it some warmth, but also some woodiness. So there's vetiver and there's also some sweetness from some vanilla. Very little sweetness, but it's there. Despite the fragrance having a relatively sharp start, it lingers on the skin as a very soft, powdery, woody musk. So Narciso Rodriguez for her EDT was formulated by Kurkdjian and also Christine Nagel, and they were under the direction of Narciso Rodriguez himself because he had a very particular idea about how he wanted this first fragrance to smell. Narciso Rodriguez himself said that he wanted to create a fragrance that was addictive, that was sensual, and that was eternally beautiful. The fragrance really was inspired by some Egyptian musk oil that one of Narciso Rodriguez's friends had given to him when he was younger, and really this friend became a bit of a muse for Narciso, and he said that he could recognise her instantaneously by her scent. He just knew that fragrance as her. Narciso said that he found that scent just addictive and he couldn't get it out of his mind, and eventually his friend relented and gave him a little bottle of this fragrance too so that he could wear it and he could enjoy it. Narciso Rodriguez is said to still wear this fragrance. He says that it's a lucky charm for him and that it reminds him constantly of his friend. Narciso has also been reported to say that this fragrance was just so special that he wanted to share it with the world and he wanted to gift it to all women. And I guess we all know that musk gives off that sort of feeling of rawness, that sort of raw carnality of bare skin and attraction. And Narciso Rodriguez himself has compared this fragrance to the feeling of love at first sight. That's really what he was trying to capture in this fragrance. So Narciso Rodriguez for her, in a way, just feels like a very timeless fragrance. It's a fragrance that wasn't really directed by any kind of trend-led market research. It was something that was very different to the fragrances that were on the market at the time when it was released. And it's also something that comes in very timeless packaging as well. If you look at the bottle of Narciso Rodriguez for her, it's not something that really dates it to a particular era. Even when you look at the advertising campaign from the original release of Narciso Rodriguez for her, it features a model called Carmen Cass, and Carmen Cass was a model that Narciso Rodriguez also considered to be a muse for him, and he actually styled her in sort of an Aphrodite kind of look. It's like she's a Grecian goddess almost. She's got this plait of hair around the crown of her head. She looks like she's not wearing anything. It's something that's a very timeless look, very much like that fragrance, and it also reflects the almost naked vulnerability of that fragrance as well, and the sexuality of that fragrance. The imagery used also perfectly reflects the fragrance's minimalistic style. So when another perfumer, Sonia Constant, who's worked on the flankers of the Narciso Rodriguez for her line, was asked why she thought that Narciso Rodriguez for her had been constantly popular over the last 20 years, she replied to say that this fragrance is something that if you get a compliment on it, people will often say things like, "Oh, you smell good," rather than "your fragrance smells good." And she says that really reflects the feeling that this fragrance is actually something that could just be your skin but better. It's not necessarily something that people recognise as a perfume, and in that way it's something that's relatively neutral and therefore isn't a trend and has lasted this long. So it wasn't only the fragrance that was groundbreaking for the Narciso Rodriguez for her line, it was also the bottle. So the bottle itself is based around a bottle that Narciso Rodriguez himself brought back from his travels in Asia. It's based on a Chinese snuff bottle. And these bottles are notoriously a bottle within a bottle. And so Narciso Rodriguez has this kind of two-layered effect. He's got this outer clear glass and then this inner coloured glass, which has like a mirrored inside on it so that no light can pass through the bottle. And the bottle itself as well in the original release was black. The EDT was marketed as a black bottle, which was incredibly rare for a female marketed fragrance at the time. Black was a colour that was very much associated with masculine marketed fragrances, not things marketed to women. So in that way, this fragrance just immediately stood out, both because of the bottle shape, design, look, and also the colour. Another interesting thing about Narciso Rodriguez for her was that when Narciso Rodriguez first developed this fragrance with his perfumers, he actually went to his celebrity clients to ask their opinions. And one person he asked about this fragrance was Sarah Jessica Parker, who often wore his designs at the time. And clearly Sarah Jessica Parker must have liked this fragrance because she later launched her own fragrance, Lovely, in 2005, which really has a lot of similarities to the EDT version of Narciso Rodriguez for her and is said to have been an inspired version of that fragrance. This version clearly has lavender, which really makes it a very distinct fragrance from Narciso Rodriguez for her, but it is really touted as something that is really trying to mimic the DNA of the Narciso Rodriguez for her EDT. So the Narciso Rodriguez for her line has won numerous awards, including the Fragrance Foundation's Fragrance of the Year award, but it is a fragrance line that has its lovers and its haters, and that really is the mark of a very good fragrance in my mind. I'll fully admit that I do not love the EDP of that line. It's something that I bought and very quickly decluttered. I just didn't like it and I bought Lovely instead, and actually I really very much preferred Lovely. But Lovely is more duping the EDT of that line. And actually, when I went and tried the EDT, I did quite like that fragrance. So I think Narciso musks are just very distinctive, aren't they? And there's something that not everybody loves. I can definitely see why somebody wouldn't like all Narciso fragrances because they are very distinctive and they do hang together as a line. So really the one that started it all was Narciso Rodriguez for her EDT, and yeah, I laud it as a very successful fragrance that's lasted over 20 years now, and I'm sure it will continue to release new flankers and continue to be a signature scent for a lot of people. So that's Narciso Rodriguez for her EDT. So the next fragrance is another one that recently celebrated a big anniversary, but this anniversary was even bigger than Narciso Rodriguez for her. And this fragrance really could be described as the most famous fragrance of all time. And yet, you've guessed it, it's Chanel No. 5. So Chanel No. 5 celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2022. And really, why has it endured that long? What is it about Chanel No. 5? And really, how did it come into being? So to know about that, we need to go back to the 20s. So Chanel No. 5 was actually inspired by another fragrance that its perfumer had already made for a different company. Chanel No. 5 was inspired by Bouquet de Catherine, which is a fragrance that Ernest Beau had made for Rallet when he was living and working in Moscow. During his time in Russia, Ernest Beau made fragrances for the Russian royal family, and he had lots of societal connections. But around the time of the Russian Revolution, Beau moved to France, and he tried to establish connections in Paris. And he did this by trying to contact people that he knew from Russia, so exiles from Russia. And one of the people he thought could really help his career, and so he ended up speaking to, was a Grand Duke. and his name was Dmitry Pavlovich. So Dmitry was actually in a relationship at the time with Chanel, and so he introduced the pair. Interestingly, Pavlovich is known as one of the murderers of Rasputin. So Rasputin at the time was a kind of holy man or a mystic who was heavily involved with the Tsarina of Russia. And people saw his influence on the Tsarina and her actions. And so there was a plot to try and stop this. And the way they tried to stop it was by trying to kill him. So Rasputin was actually a pretty hard person to kill. And he'd already been, I think, stabbed. But later on, he was also poisoned with cyanide and he still didn't die. And then eventually he was shot. So actually to kill Rasputin was quite an achievement by Pavlovich and his co-conspirators. So in 1920, Ernest Beau finally met Chanel, and he met her in Grasse, which is the home of French perfumery in the south of France. And actually Chanel was on holiday in the Côte d'Azur, and Beau presented a few different ideas for fragrances. And famously at the time, really the whole trend in perfumery was towards soliflores. So fragrances that smelled like a single flower, that were very photorealistically that flower and that flower only. And that was really the only kind of fragrance that was on the market for respectable women. Alternative fragrances at the time were those worn by prostitutes, so things that were very much indolic or some things that were very much more musky fragrances. There was very little in between, really, between those two extremes of the fragrance world. Coco Gabrielle Chanel famously said that she did not want women to smell like flowers. She wanted women to smell like something artificial. She wanted to make a fragrance for women. She wanted to construct something very much like she would construct a dress. Chanel was also very famously obsessed with cleanliness, and that's because she'd worked for very rich women as she'd been growing up, and she had experienced smelling them. She said that rich women smell of body odour, they smell of bad musk, and she wanted something really super clean for her fragrance. But at the time, clean fragrances were citrus fragrances because that was really the only thing that people had thought of to make something smell clean. And citrus was a very notoriously short-lasting note. It still is in perfumery. Show me a long-lasting citrus fragrance. They're very, very rare. And so actually Ernest Beau had a big task on his hands because in order to make a long-lasting, clean-smelling fragrance, he was going to need to do a bit of a rethink. So Ernest Beau created a fragrance with over 80 ingredients, including May Rose, jasmine, and most distinctively of all really, ylang ylang, but also containing a very signature style of aldehydes, which gave it a very bubbly, clean, soapy feeling. Chanel No. 5 was the result of months of formulations, and actually it's rumoured that Beau presented Chanel with 10 different vials, labelled from 1 to 5 and 20 to 24, and it's said that Chanel picked vial number 5. And the story varies. In some stories, Chanel is said to have just liked that one the best. In another version, the vial of number 5 contained an accidental double dose of aldehydes, said to have been made by some poor technician who didn't exactly know what they were doing. Another version has Chanel just simply picking number 5 because for Chanel, the number 5 was a notoriously lucky number. Chanel's collections were always launched on the 5th day of the 5th month. Her star sign, Leo, is the 5th star sign in the astrological calendar. And the convent gardens where she grew up contained plants and also paths arranged in repeating sets of 5. Chanel is also reported to have said that number 5 should be the fragrance's name because it will bring the fragrance luck. To begin with, only 100 bottles of Chanel number 5 were made. And, you know, Chanel was a notoriously great marketeer. She did not initially sell these bottles. She launched the fragrance initially in a restaurant. She went with some friends and she doused herself, she doused the table in Chanel number 5. And each time somebody walked past, she would wait for somebody to ask what that fragrance was. What was that smell? It was so unusual. People were curious. And she would then say the name of the fragrance, and that would start some kind of word of mouth kind of energy behind the marketing campaign of this fragrance. Very much like social media now. For Christmas in 1921, Chanel gifted Chanel number 5 to her best clients, to her best friends. And this again was a word of mouth marketing strategy. One of her friends, Misia Sert, after who the Chanel perfume Messier is actually named, said that getting a bottle of Chanel No. 5 was like winning the lottery because it was something that just could not be bought. The fragrance itself is not the only distinctive thing about Chanel No. 5, and again, it's the bottle that makes Chanel No. 5 stand out. How many people can identify Chanel No. 5 simply from the silhouette of seeing the bottle? Chanel No. 5 comes in this very distinctive, very square bottle with cut edges. It's very simple. It's very much something that's counterculture to the bottles that were on the market at the time. Really female marketed fragrances came in very elaborate cut glass bottles. They were very fussy. Chanel No. 5 is not like that. Chanel No. 5 is said to have been modelled on the aftershave bottles that Coco had seen in her lover's suitcases. It's also said that the bottle design could be based on a pharmacy vial or even on a whiskey decanter. As with a lot of Chanel's life and history, there is really a very dark side to the history of Chanel No. 5. In 1924, Chanel entered an agreement with her financiers for her Parfum Chanel brand, Pierre and Paul Wertheimer. This agreement said that the Wertheimers would produce Chanel products and sell them, and would in return would receive 70% of the profits, with the rest going to Chanel. This deal enabled Chanel to get her product in the hands of more people, but it also meant that it completely isolated her from her perfumes business. And Chanel quickly began to realise that she'd made a huge mistake. The perfume business was doing really well and it was very profitable, so Chanel fought to regain some kind of control over her perfume line. During World War II, the Nazi invasion of France afforded Chanel a dark opportunity. And actually, the Wertheimers were Jewish, which wasn't good news for them. So the Nazis introduced new laws banning Jewish people from owning businesses. In 1941, Chanel wrote to the German occupiers to claim her business back. She wrote saying that the Wertheimers were Jewish and that the business was rightfully hers. But Chanel got a shock because the brothers had turned the business over to some Christian friends of theirs. And actually these Christian friends looked after the business until the war was over and then reinstated the business into the Wertheimer name. The Wertheimers, though, eventually came to some kind of agreement with Chanel and paid Chanel a percentage of the profits throughout her lifetime. But Chanel never fully regained the control of her perfumes business. And in 1954, Paul took over the business entirely. And actually today, Paul's grandsons own Chanel and they are worth a total of $96 billion. In a further twist, Rallet, or Cherie fragrances as it was later known, was so annoyed with Ernest Beau for basically copying Bouquet de Catherine and giving it to Chanel that they tried to formulate their own clone of Chanel No. 5. And this was actually released under the Coty brand as aimant. But why has Chanel No. 5 endured for over 100 years? What's so special about Chanel No. 5? Well, of course, there's been celebrity endorsement. I think that's greatly helped. So, for example, Marilyn Monroe, very famously in the 50s, said that the only thing that she wore to bed was Chanel No. 5. And also, Chanel were very quick to cotton on to the idea of celebrity advertising, perhaps quicker than most brands. And they originally employed Catherine Deneuve to be the face of their Chanel No. 5 fragrance. Today, the face of Chanel No. 5 is Marion Cotillard. And I think really, for most people, Chanel No. 5 probably doesn't need a celebrity face to be the perfume. It's almost become synonymous with the word perfume. And I think that's really a testament to just its fame. It's not a fragrance that many people, I would say, love today. But I would say Chanel No. 5 is a fragrance that most people have tried at least once. Everyone has an opinion on it. And it's just iconic. So that's Chanel No. 5. So the final fragrance is much less famous, but I think it's still one that's very famous within the perfume community. And this fragrance I was just so intrigued by. When I heard that I'd won this fragrance, I was really, over the moon because I really wanted to try it. So this fragrance is from the brand of Robert Piguet and it's actually Bandit. So Robert Piguet was a French fashion designer and he actually trained a number of other very famous French fashion designers who went on to set up their own fashion houses. So he trained Pierre Balmain, he also trained Hubert de Givenchy, and he also trained Christian Dior. So Robert Piguet was quite controversial. In 1944, he sent models down his runway wearing his designs, but also wearing bandit masks and carrying pistols and daggers, which at the time was very, very shocking. And his friend and a perfumer called Germaine Cellier, it was said to have been mesmerised by this show, and the collection was supposed to have inspired Bandit. So Germaine Cellier is also responsible for Piguet's other famous fragrance, Fracas. And really these two fragrances can be seen as black and white. Fracas is that legendary white floral fragrance that's based around tuberose and is the white to Bandit's black. These two fragrances have been said to be reflecting different parts of Germaine Cellier's personality. So Cellier was notoriously a very elegant, slim, blonde, tall lady. But actually she also was said to have a very unconventional reputation, which at the time was very unusual. So Bandit is often described as something that's brutal yet beautiful, and is really a fragrance that's been described as something for a bad girl. Bandit has also been described as one of the best chypre fragrances, one of the best leather fragrances, and one of the best female marketed fragrances for men to wear. So Bandit is a very yellowy green, bitter fragrance to begin with, and I think that's probably the galbanum and the oak moss in this fragrance that's really giving me those feelings. I also think this is extremely loud in the beginning, and it's almost a little bit smoky. It's definitely got a leatheriness to it as well. It's almost like you're washing a saddle with some saddle soap by a bonfire. There's definitely been some kind of fuel aspect to this as well. It could almost be described as something like a diesel exhaust or something like that. It's definitely got that kind of quite heavy feel about it. Something a little bit dirty about it as well. You might even think of like an old cracked leather jacket that's being washed or conditioned and has got somebody's sweat on it and maybe some cigarette smoke. It's got that kind of dark, edgy feel about it. But I also think as this dries down, it becomes a lot easier. So the smokiness is still there, it's still prominent, but definitely the bitterness calms down. It's not quite as green anymore. That leather's not quite as raw. I think as well, in the dry down, you get the florals popping out. So in the dry down, I get more of the ylang ylang, and I also get some carnation. The carnation is almost something a little bit like a very gentle clove in this fragrance, almost something a little bit peppery almost. But yeah, I think in the dry down, it's also still soapy, but it's more got a bit of a powderiness about it. But really, the ylang ylang is the thing I notice, because when I smell this, it makes me think a little bit of Rive Gauche. Even though they're not similar fragrances, they just have that same chypre style, and they also have that ylang ylang. So do I love Bandit? Well, in a word, no. I didn't really expect to love Bandit. It's a fragrance from the 1940s. I think this is the kind of fragrance that you have to wear a number of times. And I think the first time I wore it, it was a big shock. It was something that was very smoky and very leathery and very raw and very bitter and very green. And green bitter leathers are not really something that I come across a lot. I generally go for a cleaner leather. And I think this, I haven't smelt the original, but I imagine that the reformulation is probably much gentler than the original fragrance was. I bet it's much quieter as well. And I just can't even contemplate how loud the original formulation was. Really, this fragrance is something that 99% of the population are not even going to want to try. This fragrance is very much something that is of a vintage era. It's not something that you're going to wear to work or something you're going to, go shopping in. This is a serious vintage fragrance that you are going to dress up to wear. And I think it's going to take a very certain type of person to love this fragrance. I do think this fragrance stands out. I do think it's different to every other fragrance that I've tried. And I also think this fragrance does give me that feeling of darkness and of danger. I guess these days things are very different and we're less obviously shocked by androgyny, but I can see back in the 1940s why this fragrance would have made a splash. It is very different. So why do we think that Bandit is still regarded as a classic? How did it come to prominence? Well, actually Bandit was a fragrance that was picked up by some celebrities. So Bandit was a fragrance that was actually worn by Marlene Dietrich, and Marlene Dietrich was a German actress, and she was famous for being the star of one of the first talkies in Germany in the 1930s, And that film was called Der blaue Engel, the Blue Angel. And actually on the back of that, Marlene Dietrich actually ended up moving to America. She was headhunted by Paramount. They wanted her to be their in-house actress. So she moved to America and became an American citizen in 1937. Famously, Hitler asked Marlene Dietrich to come back to Germany and to star in German films. And Marlene Dietrich very famously said, no way. And she actually said that Hitler was an idiot. And as a result, her films were banned in Germany. Marlene was branded a traitor in Germany. And even as late as 1960, when she visited Berlin, she was actually spat at and told to go back home. And it took actually until 2001, several years after Marlene's death, for Germany to apologise for their treatment of her. Interestingly, Marlene was known to have a very intense friendship with the very famous French singer Edith Piaf. Edith Piaf was known as the Little Sparrow, and she is famous for songs like La Vie en Rose and Je ne regrette rien. And she really was the darling of Paris in the 1940s and the 1950s. She was a French icon. So Dietrich and Piaf were known to write to each other and to have a very intense friendship, which was said to even go beyond the bounds of friendship and into a romantic relationship. And actually these two were said to share this fragrance, Bandit. So Marlene was said to have introduced Edith to this fragrance, and Edith wore it for a couple of years apparently. And I think that's also an important part of why this fragrance has been so successful and why this fragrance is still famous today, because of the shock factor of it being associated with lesbian history. And, you know, something that isn't shocking today, at the time, this fragrance was clearly associated with bad girls, as people might call them, but ultimately just people who had an alternative view on the world and just wanted to be themselves. So that's Bandit by Robert Piguet. So that's the final fragrance in this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have enjoyed it, then please press the like button, and please also consider subscribing if you haven't done already. And please let me know if there's a particular fragrance that you think has a really interesting history about it that I may not know about. I'd love to hear your stories. And also, do you think these fragrances would have the impact that they've had if they were released today? I'd really love to know your opinions on that. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.